Ladies and gents, here we are back in part two of a 45-part discussion of the integumentary system. Now, when we talk about the integumentary system, it's basically your skin, this outer layer, and then skin derivatives. It's all the stuff you find embedded in the skin. So if we look at this image, there is the epidermis, the outermost layer, and then the dermis. So your skin has two layers. The epidermis, epi means upon, and derm means skin. So there's the epidermis, sort of the dead outer layer, and then there's the dermis, and then like all the fun stuff's down in the dermis. So when we look at your skin, those two layers, there's all this stuff embedded in it. So those are your skin derivatives. And then this layer of fat, that's the third layer. It's technically not part of your skin, but we'll talk about that later. All right, so what's the value of the skin? Well, your skin does a lot of things for us. One is preventing mechanical damage. Mechanical damage is basically things hitting it and scraping the organs underneath. So you have this layer of sort of tough skin on the outside that prevents damage to underlying tissues. Acids and bases can change the pH surrounding organs. So again, your skin can withstand some of that. Like soap is sort of basic. So you can, wash your hands with soap, but it doesn't destroy underlying tissues. Remember, when we did the DNA extraction activity, you could use soap to break up cell membranes, right? So to help prevent that, you have this, tough protein layer on the outside. Bacteria can certainly cause damage to tissues. So again, we've got a basic layer here to prevent bacteria from getting inside the body. Radiation is energy, right? And energy can break bonds. So your skin tries to absorb some of that energy so it doesn't pass underlying tissues and cause damage. You can also resist changes to temperature and, of course, drying out. If a person gets badly burned and you burn away a lot of skin, one thing that happens is you can have a lot of water lost through exposed tissues. So basically having a dead waterproof layer on the outside helps prevent water loss to the body. We'll talk about how your body can help, your skin can help with either retaining heat or releasing heat. And glands in your skin also secrete some waste products. Like when you sweat, not only are you releasing water, you're releasing salts and things like urea and stuff like that. So when your body's being really active, you're producing all this waste. You don't just filter it out through your kidneys, you can also secrete it through your skin. And your skin plays a role in the synthesis of vitamin D. Okay, so looking at the overall structure of the skin, again, it's two layers. The epidermis and the dermis. Epi means upon, so it's that outer layer. And it's basically filled with dead keratinized cells. Okay? So you have this outer layer that's mostly just dead cells that provides that protection. It is avascular. That means there's no blood vessels. You don't really need blood vessels, though, right, if the cells are dead. So, you don't have any blood vessels there. So you can scrape some cells off the outside layer and you don't have any bleeding that occurs. If someone's bleeding, then you've gotten down into the dermis. The dermis is the connective tissue layer underneath. You can see some of the fibers that weave back and forth through here. So the dermis basically has all the stuff in it, including the blood vessels. All right, so this is a nice cutaway showing the separation of the epidermis from the dermis. Again, the epidermis, it's mostly cells that have been keratinized and are dead. And then down in the dermis, you have all sorts of receptors and blood vessels and things like that. So a lot of the stuff in your skin is in that second layer of the dermis. Now, the hypodermis. Hypo means below. The hypodermis is technically not part of the skin, but it all is sort of continuous. So in any diagram you see, they'll have the epidermis and dermis, but then they also have some of the hypodermis. Now, the hypodermis is primarily adipose tissue or fat. And that does a couple things. It does provide some mechanical protection. So, that fat provides some protection from getting bumped and banged around. Additionally, having that thin layer of fat also helps trap heat. We have much reduced body hair, so we don't have a lot of hair covering our bodies. So having that thin layer of fat beneath the skin helps us retain heat. All right. So we've got two layers of the skin, right? The epidermis and the dermis. Now let's zoom in on just the epidermis and see that there are actually other layers that we'll know, okay? So we even subdivide the epidermis. So we'll start at the bottom of the epidermis and work our way out. The bottommost layer of the epidermis at the border between the epidermis and the dermis It's called stratum basale. Don't worry about germinativum. But stratum basale, what I just remember is stratum basale is at the base. It's at the bottom of your epidermis. And that is where active mitosis is occurring. So what happens is new cells are produced in stratum basale, and then when new cells are created, they sort of push the older cells toward the surface. And as cells move closer and closer to the surface of the body, they get filled with that keratin protein and die and that kind of business. So active cell division happens in stratum basale, down at the base of your epidermis. And as cells divide, they get pushed toward the outside of your skin. So the oldest layers, or the oldest cells in your epidermis, they're the stuff on the outside. It's the dead protein-filled stuff. Okay. Now, there are multiple layers in here, like granulosum, lucidum, corneum. We're only going to focus on a couple. Again, spinosum, don't worry about any of that stuff. Here's the 3 layers you'll need to know for the epidermis. Basally, where you have cell division happening. Stratum lucidum, loose means light. So it's a layer that's just above basally, but we find stratum lucidum in the palms and in the soles. These are areas that are subject to more friction. So it's just an extra layer of cells to provide a little bit more protection. So again, we have lucidum in areas like the palms and the soles to provide a little extra protection. And then stratum corneum, that's the stuff you see. That's the outside layer. So again, those are dead keratinized cells. That's your outer waterproof layer. So if we want to think of the epidermis, the outer layer of skin, we have 3 layers. Basally at the base where cell division is happening, lucidum in the palms and soles for some extra protection, and then corneum on the outside, which is what we see, which is the dead waterproof stuff. All right, so now let's zoom back into stratum basale. Within stratum basale are cells called melanocytes. Cyto means cell, melan means this pigment. So melanocytes produce this pigment, melanin. And what melanin does is it blocks UV radiation. There's a link if you want to watch at some point. There's a link to a video, it's just a few minutes long, about skin pigmentation. That's one of your separate assignments on another day. Or I think after this lecture, we're going to watch the video here. But the basic idea is within stratum basale, melanocytes produce this melanin pigment. And what melanin does, it's a pigment similar to other pigments. And what pigments do is absorb and reflect light. Okay. So what this melanin pigment does is it absorbs UV radiation in the skin. So radiation from the sun is damaging. It can break bonds. It can do things like cause cancer. So our bodies produce melanin to try and absorb that UV radiation so there's less damage to our DNA. So our bodies produce this pigment as a means of trying to protect us. So the melanin pigments can vary. You can have sort of a lightish yellowish pigment to much darker browns and even almost black. Okay, so we can have these different pigments, and what type of pigment you produce depends on genetics, and then how much of that pigment we produce depends on both genetics and sort of exposure to UV radiation. So anyone can tan or have more melanin produced by spending time outside, because that exposure to UV radiation triggers the body to ramp up melanin production. So melanin helps block UV radiation to try and protect deeper layers of the skin. Remember, this is all in the epidermis, right? So you want to block radiation from getting beneath the epidermis, and melanin helps do that. Let's see. Well, here you get down into stratum basale, down at the base, and you can see in stratum corneum, the cells are dead and they're filled with that keratin protein. But the melanocytes will produce this melanin that basically covers the nucleus and helps block UV radiation. That's pretty cool. Okay, so the epidermis is the outermost layer. Beneath the epidermis is the dermis. Let me jump back just a tiny here. So in pink, that's the dermis. Okay, so the epidermis, we learned about basally, lucidum, and corneum, right? Now let's get down into this sort of pinkish area, which is the dermis. Now, the dermis has 2 layers that we'll learn. The papillary layer and the reticular layer. Papilla means finger. So the papillary layer is noticeable because you see how it's sort of wavy like this? So there are a couple things about that. In the papillary layer, we have light touch receptors, which makes sense. That's near the surface of the skin, so that if you have very light touch, Those receptors are near the surface of the skin, so it's easier to detect. Um, Now, why is the papillary layer wavy like that? Well, what it does is it causes what's called interdigitation. So imagine if the papillary and the layer beneath the reticular layer were smooth. If they were smooth, it'd be really easy to sort of separate those layers. But because they're interdigitated like that, because you have that wavy layer, it makes it more difficult for shearing forces to separate the layers. So by having that wavy layer in the papillary layer, it basically helps keep your epidermis attached to your dermis so that you don't get those things separated out. Additionally, that waviness causes the ridges that we see in our fingerprints. Okay. Now, the deeper layer is the reticular layer. The reticular layer, it's notable because it has a lot of tough protein fibers that make your dermis tough. Leather, if you've had like leather shoes, leather jacket, leather anything, leather is made from the dermis of animals. What they do is they'll scrape off the epidermis on the outside, they'll scrape off the hypodermis that has all the fatty layer, and then they have the layer of the dermis left, and that stuff is incredibly tough. So leather is basically the dermis. And the dermis is mostly these tough protein fibers that make the skin difficult to tear. Okay. Now, within the reticular layer, you got all sorts of stuff: blood vessels, pain receptors, light touch receptors, glands that produce sweat and different types of oils. So, again, there's a lot of business going on in the reticular layer. All right. So, let's take a look at this again. You'll see the epidermis. The epidermis has basally lucidum in the palms and soles, and then corneum. The dermis has the wavy layer here. That's the papillary layer where you have some light touch receptors and that kind of business. And then the reticular layer is down here. Now, throughout the reticular layer, you have these collagen and elastin proteins. Collagen, again, makes your skin tough so it doesn't rip. And then elastin makes it stretchy so that when you release that pressure, it goes back to what it was. So collagen and elastin are the proteins that make up the bulk of the dermis, and they make the skin tough and stretchy. Now, blood vessels. How do they help with temperature regulation? You have blood vessels going to the dermis, right? Now, blood vessels will come from deeper tissues. And remember, there's this fatty hypodermis that's sort of like a layer of insulation. So have you ever seen someone that looks like they've been exercising or something and they're hot and their face turns red or their skin turns red? Well, that's because if they're hot, the blood vessels in the dermis dilate. And if the blood vessels dilate, that brings more blood to the surface. And so what it does is it allows, since the warm blood is close to the surface, the heat can radiate out. So if people appear reddish in the face or in the skin after exercise or during exercise, it's because blood vessels are dilating to try and bring that blood to the surface so it can radiate out. It can cool them off. Now, sometimes if people are cold, they'll look pale. And that's because if your body is cold, you need to send blood to the vital organs, right? Your skin isn't as vital to life as, say, your heart or your lungs. So what your body will do in that instance is narrow or constrict the blood vessels and then send that blood to the vital organs. If you're sending less blood to the skin, then it becomes paler. And so that can occur. Now, what if somebody has their hand in ice water for a long time? Well, you could actually start to damage those tissues. So your body responds to that by dilating the blood vessels to bring more blood to the surface so you don't freeze. So, you can help with temperature regulation by having blood vessels dilate or constrict. If the blood vessels in the dermis dilate, you're bringing more blood to the surface to have it radiate out, trying to cool you off. If you have the blood vessels constrict, it brings less blood to the surface, so you keep the warm blood in the body to try and retain heat. So it's really a cool way for your body to try and thermoregulate. All right, so this is just a nice image showing the layers. Here you see the epidermis. Again, down at the bottom, those are where the melanocytes are producing that dark melanin. Then stratum corneum is on the outside. That's the dead keratinized stuff. The papillary layer, again, it has the light touch receptors and the pain receptors, and it causes your fingerprints. And then the reticular layer, you see all those proteins in there, making it tough and stretchy. So what helps determine skin coloration? The types of pigments that can be found in the skin have a big impact on that. So again, there's melanin that helps absorb UV radiation, and there are different versions of melanin. Carotene sort of sounds like carrots, right? Well, carotene is an orangish pigment, and people can produce or consume this carotene pigment. There have actually been cases of people that eat so many carrots for an extended period of time, and their body can't break down the carotene quickly enough, and actually turns their skin orange from eating so many carrots. And again, hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a molecule found in red blood cells that carry oxygen around. So hemoglobin in your red blood cells helps provide sort of a reddish tone or pinkish tone to skin if you have paler skin. All right, the foldable, we'll do that another time. Ideas for what can alter skin tone. Different reasons for this. Redness or erythema. The redness in the skin, again, for a person with paler complexion, it can be due to emotional reasons like embarrassment. It could be due to things like fever. If your body temperature increases, well, then your body's going to try and release that heat, so you dilate blood vessels in the surface of the skin to try and release that, or like allergic reaction, stuff like that. Pallor or blanching of the skin can happen if a person is really scared. So you can imagine if someone's scared, your body's going to have this autonomic response that sends blood to like your muscles and your heart and lungs, stuff like that. So rather than sending the blood to your skin, it's sent to these critical organs that help keep you alive, so your skin turns pale. Additionally, like with anemia, you might have issues with hemoglobin production. So if you're not carrying as much oxygen, that can cause paleness of the skin. Again, idea with like low blood pressure, you're not pumping that blood to the surface and things like that. Jaundice or yellowing of the skin can be caused because of issues with the liver, or like in newborns, or another way to alter skin coloration is bruising. If a person has a bruise, you've broken blood vessels, right? So when that blood breaks down, it breaks down through a series of steps. And as you break blood down, it becomes new molecules. And those new molecules have different colors. So sometimes the bruise will be like purple, brown, green, yellow, and then it fades away. And that's because as you break down that blood, you create these new molecules, and the new molecules reflect different colors of light. All right, we'll finish up with skin appendages. Very good. Thanks for sticking with it, guys.